Okay, so last week we looked at the social, cultural, political milieu of the world into which Jesus was born and taught. We looked at his life, his death, the formation of the first community, the role played by Paul in expanding the community among the Gentiles. Tonight I'm going to focus on the formation of Christian text, both oral and written, as well as some of the conflicting images of Jesus that began to emerge in the late 1st and early 2nd centuries CE. But before doing so, I need to mention an event that would permanently change the world of Judaism and likewise have a major impact on the development of early Christianity. And I am referring to the destruction of the temple of Herod, the Jewish temple, in 70 CE by the Roman legions. In 66 CE, the Jewish Zealots, do you remember the Zealots that I mentioned last time? These were the rebels, led an insurrection. It actually drove the Romans out. We often tend to think it takes big armies. We've learned that insurrections can be small groups. They drove the Romans out. But the Romans returned in 70 CE, led by the future emperor Titus. We say Titus, but in Latin it's Titus. And laid siege to the city and eventually sacked it and destroyed the temple. And the Arch of Titus today celebrates that event, and that's in Rome. You probably, if you've been to Rome, you've probably seen it. That's why it was built, the basis of the destruction of the temple. The Jewish historian, and we'll come across him later again, the historian Josephus claims that over 1 million people were killed during that siege. So it was a major battle. And many fled to areas around the Mediterranean, what became known as the Jewish Diaspora. This is when Jews left Judea and went out through all the Mediterranean world. They were fleeing because although the Romans had destroyed much of the city, it wasn't just the temple. The city was virtually leveled, much like the Romans did to Carthage, if you know what they did there. In any case, it marked the end of what is known as Temple Judaism. Because remember, Judaism at this time was centered on the temple and the sacrifices that took place there through the priesthood. This ends Temple Judaism and the beginning of what is now referred to as Rabbinic Judaism, whereby the Talmud, which is a primary source of Jewish law and theology, became the authoritative interpretation of Jewish scripture, and the synagogue replaced the temple as the center of Jewish worship. So you would find throughout the Mediterranean world various synagogues. There was only one temple. And I think I've said today when we see, even here where it's referred to as temple so-and-so, it's really not the temple. There was only one temple, and it's destroyed. It's gone. So for the early followers of Jesus, 70 CE was a major turning point in that the church at Jerusalem disappeared. The early church at Jerusalem disappears at this point. Most of its leaders, including James, were likely killed. Catholic tradition holds that Peter escaped and went to Rome. That's why Rome is Peter's place. And he was beheaded there under the reign of Nero, according to tradition. We don't have any real historical reference to that, but that's what tradition has said. What's important here for early Christianity is this meant that the center of the Christian world would now be the Greco-Roman world and not Judea. Judea is virtually destroyed at this point, with the consequence that Hellenistic cultural elements would become increasingly dominant in Christianity. So, That's the background. Jesus dies in approximately 30 CE. The earliest writings that we have, as I mentioned last time, come from the Apostle Paul. It's the epistles, dating between 51 and 58 CE. So approximately 21 to 27 years later. And as I said before, they deal really more with the risen Christ than with the historical Jesus. Because remember, Paul never met Jesus. He met the Christ in a vision, if you will. The book of Acts, there's the epistles. The book of Acts, which is generally dated between 60 and 64, so from, let's say, 58, 2 to 5 years after the epistles, although some have dated it as late as 90. These dates are, they're not spot on. They're the best guesses in some cases. The book of Acts tells the story of the early church with particular emphasis on the ministries of Peter and Paul. The early chapters are set in Jerusalem. They discuss Jesus' resurrection, his ascension, and the start of the apostles' ministry. Tradition holds that it was written by Luke, physician and companion of Paul, which tradition would say that he also wrote the Gospel of Luke. Again, we don't have any of these original manuscripts, by the way. The earliest manuscripts are about 200 to 250 CE. That's important from a historian's point of view. Do you see why? What happens to manuscripts over time? Yeah, ever tried copying something without a video, yeah, where you actually have to copy it by hand? And then, and Gene has covered this in his course on manuscripts. There will be mistakes made, obviously, and errors, and sometimes even deliberate, not in the sense that, this guy who copied it before didn't really understand, so I'll just change it a bit. So in any case, and we don't have the complete manuscripts. We've only got fragments. So you can see the problem of trying to put all of this together. Okay. The first gospel is thought to have been written somewhere between 60 and 70 CE. Okay, so if Jesus dies in 30, that's about 30 to 40 years afterwards. Yeah. Again, no original, only fragments of manuscripts. As regards the Gospels, many scholars also assume there were earlier written sources whose manuscripts no longer exist. I'll say more about this in a little bit when I talk about Q, if you've ever heard of Q. Why do you think that's posited? You've got two Gospels, let's say Matthew and Luke, have a lot of the same things in them. And if these two didn't correspond with one another, how did they get the same material? The assumption is there was an earlier text which they drew on. Now, Q isn't an actual text that you can find. It's an assumed text. But it's assumed on some sort of rationality. But I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. But does that make sense if you have two texts that have a lot of the same material, often word for word, and yet it doesn't appear that they knew one another? Tradition would say they did, but scholars wonder. Then you come up with these speculations. In any case, given these dates, the question arises, what was going on for the first 20 to 30 years? The best general guess, and this is more or less accepted by most scholars, is there was an oral tradition. There was an oral tradition that developed. That's stories about Jesus that were not written down, but were spread by word of mouth. This is based both on the knowledge and functioning of oral traditions in other cultures. This is quite common. Other times, other places, as well as the fact that most of Jesus' earliest followers were illiterate. 97% of Palestine at that time was considered to be illiterate. Only a few people at the top could read. And according to Acts 4:13, this included Peter. Peter was illiterate, according to Acts, which shouldn't be surprising. Fishermen didn't. So in this regard, it is generally accepted that though the essential kernel of the story likely remained, all these stories, it's also probable there were some changes that took place. You ever played the game called telephone? If I gave 4 or 5 lines to Reverend Albert and we passed it through everybody's ear, by the time it got over here, how many bet that it would be exactly the same? Okay. Sometimes you can get some amazing differences if you've ever played that. Go home, have a party, invite your friends over and play telephone. See what happens. In any case, so this is what is considered to probably have happened. And we'll see later that there are even differences in the Gospels themselves. Okay. So let us now turn to the 4 canonical Gospels. But before looking at the particulars, a few general comments need to be made. All 4 books were written, as far as we know, anonymously. Why do we say that? Because none of the earliest manuscripts have names on them. When we open a Bible and it says, according to Matthew, those aren't on the earlier manuscripts. In fact, it's really not until the 2nd century where one Bishop Papias from Asia Minor gave the designations to the books. Now, he was claiming to base this, he didn't just pick them out of straw, but he claimed that he had some information, and this is where they became Mark, being John Mark, Peter's personal secretary, Matthew, the disciple of Jesus, the tax collector, Luke, Greek physician, traveling companion of Paul, and John, son of Zebedee, and one of Jesus' closest disciples. Many New Testament scholars, however, believe that none of the authors were among Jesus' disciples. Now, I'm not saying they weren't, but I'm saying this is what a lot of scholarship has tended to come up with, which, if you're a listening audience, the first thing you'd ask me is what? Why? Why have they come to this conclusion? There's some reasons. First of all, if you've ever read the Gospels, you know that none claim to be disciples in the text. They're sort of written from a third-person point of view, aren't they? It doesn't say, I'm Matthew writing this. That's not there. According to the Gospels, Jesus' followers were largely uneducated. What language were the Gospels written in? Greek. Highly educated Greek, not Aramaic. So that would assume that Jesus' disciples had a fair knowledge of High Greek. Not likely. I'm not saying not possible, but probably not likely. Thus, it's generally accepted that these Gospels were written by highly literate, educated Greek Christians writing several decades after Jesus' death, and that's where the dates come in. The Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke are referred to specifically as the Synoptic Gospels because, as previously mentioned, they include many of the same stories, often in the same sequence, with similar wording. Synoptic actually can be translated as same eye. That's what synoptic means, same eye. And this fact is accounted for, as I mentioned earlier, that they must have been derived at least partially from earlier material. So do you see the diagram up here? Q influenced Luke, Q influenced Matthew, and Mark, which we'll get to in a moment, which was the earliest gospel, influenced both Matthew and Luke. Again, don't ask me to bring in the text of Q. It's an assumed text based on a certain level of reasoning. Is it possible there was no Q? Of course. Yeah.
I think it's important to understand that Q is not necessarily a singular source.
No, no.
It's a collection of sources.
Yeah, collection of sources, which may have had other things that influenced it. Yes, it gets rather complex. But I think it is important to recognize that this is, most scholars deal with this larger paradigm. Mm-hmm. So it's also important to realize that the Gospels are essentially the only sources we have that make reference to the historical Jesus. It's often been wondered about. First century pagan sources, non-existent. No pagan source. Later, Tacitus will refer when we get to the Roman period, but early, no sources. Indicating, and why that Jesus had no impact on pagan writers or philosophers of his time, and why should he? Some guy down in the boonies of the empire causing trouble? Okay, so we do have a Jewish source, and that was our Josephus, who was a Jewish aristocrat who had actually fought against the Romans initially, later became an interpreter for them, and worked to convince Jews to surrender during the Roman-Jewish War. Was that because he was a traitor? It's because he was... You don't surrender, you know what's going to happen? And it did happen. So he later goes to Rome and becomes the court historian for a Roman emperor. I guess there might be some that feel he sold himself out. But in any case, he's interesting as a source because he wrote two books, one called The Jewish Wars and the other called The Antiquities. He doesn't mention Jesus in the first, but the name appears twice in the latter. That's in the Antiquities. First, that he was called by some the Messiah and had a brother, James. And second, he was a wise man known to perform spectacular deeds, and that he was brought up on charges before Pilate and crucified. That's all we have. Which essentially means that when it comes to the historical Jesus, we have to rely on the gospel texts and some brief information in Paul. I think it said you can probably put what Paul writes about in a 3x5 index card. Yeah. Now, for a historian, this is problematic. Yeah, just as a historian, why is it problematic? You only have information from sources of believers. That doesn't mean it's wrong, but for a historian, that becomes a bit of an issue. It would be like if you tried to get an accurate picture of Joseph Smith and only had Mormon documents. A historian wants to find a wider range of documents as possible. Again, this doesn't say it's not possible. Okay. And I already mentioned the gospel was written some 30 to 35 years later. A lot of things happen in that time. And there are discrepancies in the gospels. I'll point out a few down the line. So having said that, we can now briefly survey the style and content of these four gospels. The Gospel of Mark, shortest, earliest account of Jesus' life in the New Testament. Mark's major theme is that Jesus was the Messiah who had to suffer and die for the sins of the world. This is the suffering servant trope or motif. You've probably heard the suffering servant. 65-70 CE, earliest manuscript fragment about 200. But Mark points out, despite his teachings, his spectacular healings and exorcisms, virtually no one, including the disciples, really understand his true identity. It's a very important part of Mark. The disciples are presented, and this is important, as holding to the traditional view, the traditional Jewish view of the Messiah, who would be an individual with worldly power, who would overthrow forces opposed to God. If you look at the tradition of the Jewish Messiah, he's going to be a warrior. He's not. Thus, Mark is designed to demonstrate how Jesus could be the Messiah despite not only worldly suffering, but also his crucifixion. How can your Messiah, who is coming to save the Jewish people, end up being crucified? So that's what Mark is now. He's trying to turn the tables of traditional understanding. That is, Jesus was the Messiah because he suffered and died. That's a big turnaround. It's significant that Mark's gospel begins not at Jesus' birth, but at his baptism by John. Jesus didn't look like this. You got to remember, these are Germanic views. In any case, indicating perhaps that his nativity wasn't seen as important, if you don't include it, or more importantly, that he is being announced by a prophet of God. Okay? So the book begins with John's, which is essentially announcing Jesus as Messiah. He next goes into the wilderness to do battle with the devil, then returns to begin his ministry by demonstrating his power through numerous miracles, healings, etc. But despite that, no one recognizes him for who he is. His family thinks he's gone mad. Again, there's passages say the family thought he was crazy. Jewish leaders thinks he's possessed by the devil. And his disciples are said not to understand who he really is. Mark 6:51 through 52 and 8 through 21 if you want to check references. Who knows his identity? God. Only God. At the beginning of, this ignorance continues until the middle of the gospel when he finally asks Peter who the disciples think he is. Peter responds that he is the Messiah. And even then, Jesus warns the disciples not to tell anyone and that he must go to Jerusalem and die. Peter challenges him. How could the Messiah suffer and die? And Jesus responds telling Peter, can do that. He rebukes him. Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of the world. So they don't understand. To reinforce the suffering Messiah trope, Mark spends a great deal of time dealing with the final week of Jesus' life. Indeed, the gospel is sometimes called a passion narrative with a long introduction. And up until nearly the end of the gospel, there are doubts as to Jesus' identity. Even Jesus himself. What does he say in Mark on the cross? My God, why have you forsaken me? It is only following the death, when the temple curtain is ripped open, that it's made clear. This is the curtain that separated the most holy place in the temple, where the Ark of the Covenant was kept, and only the high priest could go in, separated that from everything else. Do you see the imagery here? That's torn asunder. That old notion of separation is being torn asunder when Jesus dies. 3 days after Jesus' death, female followers go to the tomb where they see a young man dressed in white who tells them that Jesus has risen. They flee in fear and say nothing to anyone, according to Mark. Here it should be noted that a number of biblical scholars, including Robert Price and Peter Kirby, to name just a few, have pointed out in Paul's epistles, which predate Mark, there's no mention of an empty tomb. Okay. Possible implication. Mark's material was added later. Paul didn't think it was important. Paul didn't know. We don't know. But it's an interesting idea. The earliest of writings doesn't mention an empty tomb. Mark does. So let's move to the Gospel of Matthew. See if we can see some differences. Dated 80 to 90 CE, earliest manuscript, again around 200, again only fragments. It's similar to Mark in many ways. Very many common episodes, often recounted word for word. But Matthew also contains stories and passages not found in Mark. For example, the birth story, the Lord's Prayer, the Beatitudes. They're in Matthew. As in Mark, Jesus is portrayed as Messiah, Son of God, whose death was seen as necessary to bring about salvation. But as Bart Ehrman, one of my favorites, scholars, professor of New Testament studies at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, has emphasized, there is a stress in Matthew both on Jesus' Jewishness and his opposition to Orthodox Judaism as he found it, which has led many scholars to consider this text the most Jewish in its understanding of Jesus. Whereas Mark starts with Jesus' baptism, what does Matthew open with? A genealogy. A genealogy. This genealogy traces Jesus' line back to Abraham, and then through David. Of course, Abraham was the father of the Jewish people. Why is David important in this genealogy? Because through David will come the Messiah. Through David's line. That was part of the traditional belief. So we start with that, this genealogy. We're setting this up to the Jewish notion of Messiah. This is followed by stories related to Jesus' birth and subsequent developments. And this is what's interesting, which appear to intentionally mirror the account of Moses' birth and subsequent developments as found in the Torah. In both cases, a boy is born under a hostile regime. The ruling powers want to destroy him. Pharaoh, Herod. He's divinely protected. He sojourns in Egypt. Remember, according to Matthew, after the birth, Joseph and Mary flee to Egypt. He leaves Egypt and goes through water. The Red Sea for Moses, Jesus' baptism. The trope implies Jesus is the new Moses, a new savior of the Jewish people. Again, like Moses, Jesus goes to a mountain and delivers God's law to the people. Sermon on the Mount, Sinai. In the Sermon on the Mount, he does not deny the law of Moses, but reinterprets it by means of the so-called antitheses, whereby he places his own teaching in opposition to the common misunderstandings and practices of the law which he found around him. For example, Moses said not to kill. Jesus says one should not even become angry. No wonder Luther said you couldn't follow this. And then there's the famous, you have heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be the sons of your Father in heaven. Here Jesus wants his hearers not to follow the letter of the law, but its spirit, which is often much more difficult. Thus, they must follow the law more completely than the scribes and the Pharisees. And Matthew will often point this out. The scribes and the Pharisees, in fact, he refers to the Pharisees as whitewashed sepulchres. Clean on the outside, but rotten on the inside. Always able to quote the law, but the spirit of the law avoiding it. Jesus sees such people as hypocrites, and this is where I think I mentioned last time, often the word Pharisee is equated with hypocrite. They weren't all hypocrites, but what it really means is these were people, sort of self-righteous legalists. Okay? They could tell you everything, and they're always trying to catch Jesus up on some little legal notion, like you can't heal people on the Sabbath. What's the spirit? You heal people. Okay? In any case, they stress the picayune and overlook what is central, or is called straining on gnats but swallowing camels. And this anti-ecclesiastical position can also be found in the presentation of Jesus' death in Matthew, where blame is placed on Jewish leadership after Pilate washes his hands. Now, such a presentation can, and I must say, has promoted a certain degree of anti-Semitism, but its focus is not on Judaism per se. Because Matthew sees that Jesus was a good Jew, but on its leadership, the religious leadership of the time. So in summary, Matthew is a book about the Jewish Messiah who attempted to purify Judaism of his time, was defeated by Jewish leadership, but whose death and resurrection marked God's victory. So both Mark and Matthew, it's a defeated Messiah. Now that's hard to sell. It is. It's hard to try to sell that notion at this time. Shia Islam, by the way, has the same thing, where Hussein is martyred at Karbala. And then that turns things around. That martyrdom proves that he's holy and divine, rather than success. Okay, the Gospel of Luke. Yeah, I got so carried away, I was forgetting all these. Okay, the Gospel of Luke. Attributed, like I said, to the Gentile physician who was a companion of Paul, claims he was the same author as the book of Acts. It's estimated it was written again around 85 CE. Similar author probably used Mark as a source as well as Q. Unlike Mark, Luke does not stress the failure of people to recognize Jesus. In fact, right from the beginning, he is recognized. He's recognized by shepherds, who are the lowest of the low in society. He's recognized by the Magi. So right from the beginning, he is recognized. So that does not really become an issue here. And unlike Matthew, he does not stress that Jesus is the new Moses, who demanded his followers adhere to the law. Instead, he's a Messiah for all people, not just the Jews. And this is a big break. If you just read Mark and Matthew, the audience is primarily Jewish. With Luke, we find a big jump. Now, this makes some sense, especially if he is related to Paul, who is an apostle to the Gentiles. This doesn't mean Luke didn't see Jesus as a Jew. He saw him as a Jew. Rather, since he had been rejected by his own people, his message of salvation is now open to all people. That's why the gospel contains a genealogy. It differs from the genealogy found in Matthew. in that Jesus' lineage isn't traced, well, it goes through David and Abraham, but it doesn't stop there. Where does it go? To Adam. Who's Adam? The father of all humanity. Now that's interesting. We might think that's very important. Here's two genealogies. One stops at Abraham. That's a Jewish genealogy. The other goes all the way back to Adam. And significantly, the fact that Jesus is rejected becomes in Luke the basis of a new theological paradigm, whereby God knows that Jesus will be rejected and uses its rejection as a means for granting universal salvation. Thus, the idea that Jesus had to be crucified as part of the divine plan. You remember Jesus Christ Superstar? Who becomes almost the hero in that? Judas. Because if Jesus has to be crucified, someone has to betray him. How do you fit this in unless you have an overall view that there's some sort of plan that's much larger? And this you find in Luke. It's this universal plan which often involves the will of God. Nothing happens that has not been foreseen. Thus we find in Luke, Jesus explicitly saying that he must go to Jerusalem to be killed because that is where the prophets die. And because he knows God's will, Luke's portrayal of Jesus' crucifixion is different from Matthew's. Rather than being silent and shocked, feeling forsaken, in Luke, Jesus dies in virtual control of the situation. What does he say? Father, in your hands I commit my spirit. Very much different than why hast thou forsaken me? So you get a different image here. Finally, in Luke, we don't find an emphasis on the immediate apocalyptic end of the world. Luke modifies Jesus' words to his disciples so that there is no longer a sense that the world will come to an end during their lifetime. When they ask him about such things, Jesus replies, "But when you hear of wars and commotions, do not be terrified, for these things must come to pass first, but the end will not come immediately." How does that fit in? Well, it not only reflects reality in the year 85, the world hadn't come to an end. But it also involves the fact that time was needed for the gospel to spread throughout the Gentile world. If this is a plan for universal salvation, it's got to have time. So it's an interesting comparison when you look at the way the apocalyptic notion is presented in the two Gospels. It's also, since the world is continuing, a number of scholars have noted that there's a stronger social agenda in Luke as opposed to Mark and Matthew. Thus, in his version of the Beatitudes, I'm sorry, I'm getting carried away with myself. In Matthew, it says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." In Luke, it says, "Blessed are the poor." Now, this is an issue does this really mean something different? Well, it could. Because, I mean, if you just read the two by themselves, you would probably get something different. Okay? And he also pays more attention to women. For example, in Luke 10, 38, 42, and this is a story only found in Luke, a certain Martha complains to Jesus that her sister Mary is sitting before him and not helping her with the womanly duties. And Jesus replies that Mary has chosen the right path. Now, we're not talking about 1960s USA here. For a woman to sit with men and hear the message of a teacher, that was radical. That was radical. Now, remember, if this is a gospel that's written for the Gentile world, you're trying to expand out. And Paul often gets, I think, kind of a bad rap about his position on women. And there might be some reason to do that. But you got to remember the context. When he requires you to wear something on your head, if you didn't, do you know what you were? You're likely a prostitute. That's the social context. That's why it's so important to understand the historical and social context in looking at anything. Okay, in conclusion, the Gospel of Luke moves beyond the presentation of Jesus as solely a Jewish Messiah to a vision of a universal Messiah for both Jew and Gentile, and that this is part and parcel of God's divine plan. That leaves us with one Gospel, John. Whereas Mark, Matthew, and Luke are so similar in content and design, they can be laid side by side. And I would suggest doing this. It's called parallel reading. Rather than read one, put them side by side and look at whatever is being discussed. You'll see some interesting differences. But in any case, the Gospel of John is very different. So much so that in biblical scholarship, it has sometimes been referred to as the Maverick Gospel. It is very different than the other three. Generally considered the latest of the canonical Gospels, written sometime between 90 and 100 CE. So we're getting close to 70 years after Jesus' crucifixion. Early manuscript about 125 CE. At the core of this account lies Jesus' identity not as a rejected prophet or a Jewish Messiah, although he's considered those, but rather as a divine incarnation of God's Word, through which he created the universe. Opening line, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. Now, if anybody here has studied Neoplatonic Greek philosophy, that's it. It is. It's it. This was a core idea of Greek Neoplatonic philosophy, which held that original being, the source of all things, manifests itself as divine intelligence, nous, N-O-U-S, which is the perfect image of itself. Write an essay on that for me. What I'm trying to put, do you see how different that is compared to, okay? This isn't the stuff of, and I'm not putting down fishermen, but this is high Greek philosophy, right at the beginning. As to content, John is lacking in many of the stories that we find in the Synoptics. No birth story, no baptism, no temptation in the wilderness, no parables, no transfiguration. On the other hand, the gospel contains a number of stories not found in the Synoptics. Many related to miraculous deeds, such as turning water into wine and the raising of Lazarus from the dead. In addition, some of the most memorable sayings attributed to Jesus are found only in John, including, "You must be born again," and the "I am" sayings, in which he identifies himself as the one who can bring salvation. These include, "I am the light of the world. I am the bread of life. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." Hold on, Ron, we're going to discuss that at the end. And when the stories in John and the Synoptics are the same, there are some significant discrepancies between them. For example, the cleansing of the temple and the day of Jesus' death. In John, the cleansing of the temple takes place at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, while in the Synoptics, it occurs during the final week of his life. In John, Jesus dies on the afternoon before the Passover meal, known as the day of preparation. That was the day lambs were slaughtered at the temple by Jewish priests. They're slaughtered before Passover. Why? Because you eat it at Passover. Mm-hmm. In the Synoptics, he is executed the morning after the Passover meal. All right. What does that matter? Yeah. And to some degree, it may not. Although in the case of the latter, it does have some theological import. Let me try and explain why. John is the only gospel that specifically identifies Jesus as the Lamb of God. You see the connection? When does the Lamb of God have to be sacrificed? On the day of preparation. Not on Passover. John records as the day Jesus was executed. If you're interested, 1914. In other words, John's account fits his theology, which isn't such a big, that's not unusual. In summary, John's Jesus is not just a compassionate miracle worker or just a Jewish Messiah. He is a divine incarnation of the Godhead, which will become the basis of the later Trinitarian theology, which we'll talk about next week. Sent by God for the salvation of the world, who performed numerous miracles to prove his claim. So the Gospels, I'm not doing too bad tonight. The Gospels thus present us with both theological as well as some factual differences. If you're really interested in all the factual differences, I'd suggest do a parallel reading of the birth and resurrection narratives, if you're interested. And does everyone understand what a parallel reading is now? You take one and you put it next to it and you read the event. But let me just give you some examples from the resurrection narratives. This only becomes important, really, to some degree, if you think that every word has to be of divine origin in all four Gospels. If you do, then there's an issue, because only in Matthew is there a Roman guard at the tomb. There are different details about how many women go to the tomb. Just Mary Magdalene in John. Mary along with others in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. There are different numbers of angels reported at the tomb. 1 in Matthew and Mark, 2 in Luke and John. Also, the sequence of to whom Jesus appeared differs somewhat in the various Gospels. Then there is the question of where Jesus appeared after his resurrection. In Galilee, according to Matthew and Mark. Around Jerusalem, according to Luke. Now, do these things make big differences? Perhaps not. Only if you think that everything has to be the divine word, because then you're going to run into problems, because there are contradictions. The interesting contradictions to me, or differences, are the one I mentioned earlier, where there are theological implications. These, does it matter if there were 2 or 5 angels? I don't think so. Okay, so despite all, now do you see all the different, if you look at these Gospels, there are different images of Jesus that are presented. But despite these differences, I think if you read them all, you get a pretty good picture of what the Gospels say concerning what Jesus was teaching, or his way. Interestingly, early Christians called themselves followers of the way. Almost like you would say the path. So what were these, if we kind of took the core out of all of them? A condemnation of overly ritualistic and legalistic approach to religion, 1. 2, the spiritual dangers of worldly attachment, riches and power. 3, the significance of social justice, especially as regards the poor and dispossessed. 4, a nonviolent approach to social and political conflict. And 5, the need for forgiveness as a dominant theme in life. And all of these grounded in an ultimate faith in God. That's the core. You know, the variations on the themes are there. But if you read all the Gospels, you can draw this core out. So, in addition to the canonical Gospels, there were 20 other Gospels, ranging in time from composition from the 2nd to the 8th century CE, that did not make it into the New Testament. And these are divided roughly into 2 kinds. A narrative gospel, which, like the canonical Gospels, contain accounts, it's a story, a narrative, and the sayings Gospels, which don't have a narrative, but just a list of sayings that Jesus was supposed to have said. The best example of a narrative form is the Gospel. It's the Gospel of Peter. Didn't make it in, and probably for good reason. You'll see in a moment. Fragments of which were discovered near the end of the 19th century, but whose existence had been known because it had been mentioned by the early church fathers who condemned it as heretical. So it shows that there were heretical Gospels. And we're going to be talking about the development of the canon next time. Who decides what goes in? That's an interesting question. In any case, it is purported to have been written by Jesus' disciple Peter. Most scholars consider it to be a forgery, written sometime during the 2nd century CE. What are its striking features? It claims that Jesus did not suffer. Getting back to the older Jewish narrative of the Messiah doesn't suffer. Interestingly, the Quran says the same thing. And it's known that Muhammad associated with a lot of Jews and Christians. He was hearing lots of stories. So it makes kind of sense, right? It makes sense that your Messiah isn't going to suffer and he's going to be victorious. In any case, the other interesting thing about this gospel, it makes it rather fantastic, is that when Jesus comes out of the tomb, he's accompanied by this, a big cross. Now you can take that symbolically, or you can how you want to take it. But in any case, this is the Gospel of Peter. Why it's important? Because it demonstrates how details of the resurrection theme expanded over time. There's a general principle here. The longer the story, the later the story. How many fish stories get smaller? The longer you tell a story, generally it expands. Okay? The best example of a sayings gospel is the Gospel of Thomas, whose discovery was part of the Gnostic gospel find in the 1940s in Upper Egypt, a place called Nag Hammadi, and I'll be talking about Gnosticism next week. The author of the book calls himself Didymus Judas Thomas. He was believed in parts of the ancient church to be a brother of Jesus. It contains 114 sayings, no narrative. Composition range 40 to 140 CE. Majority of scholars see it in the 2nd century. The text contains possible allusion to the death of Jesus, but does not mention the crucifixion, the resurrection, or the final judgment. Nor does it mention a messianic understanding of Jesus. I like that. The main point made by the gospel is that those who learn about Jesus' secret teachings will attain eternal life. You're not all capable, friends. There are only those among you who are spiritually elite, who can understand the true teachings. Some sayings mirror those found in the canonical Gospels, but others portray, and this is important, as the world as a place that must be escaped. You are in a trap. You have been trapped, and the biggest trap you have is your body. Your body traps you. You know, when I say this to younger people, they kind of laugh. When I say it to older people, sometimes go, hey, maybe there's a bit of truth there. The body is likened to a set of clothes that must be removed, even trampled on, if one is to be saved. No sex. Moreover, salvation is not something that will come in the future. It's available right here through gnosis. Gnosis means knowledge. You know where you get the term agnostic? I don't know. A Gnostic knows. And it's not knowledge like 2 + 2 = 4. It's a spiritual knowledge. Yeah. And once you know these teachings, which Jesus is an example of, then you can reunite your spirit with the ultimate spirit. And so the major significance of these Gospels, they demonstrate there was a wide divergence of opinion of who Jesus was and what he taught. And we're going to be talking about how these come to any sort of formulation next week. I just need to say, and I'm sure all of you know these texts very well, there are several other parts of the New Testament. These are epistles that have claimed to be written by the apostles of Jesus. There's James, 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and Jude. Has anyone ever heard a sermon on Jude? Maybe you could, should we ask? These are small little letters that are and people sort of wonder why they're even there at some point, but they are part. I thought I needed to mention that. And then one other big important book, which Reverend Elbert's going to be giving a class on after this finishes, the Book of Revelation. Yeah. So, next week we're going to consider the question of how all these images and text became somehow brought together when we trace the development of orthodoxy in the terms of canon, texts, creed, and ecclesiastical authority, the church. So we'll do that next week.